Okay, good day, everyone. My name is Leonore Shikune, and I'm the Communications Director of the International Water Resources Association. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all here today for the masterclass public lecture titled Situation Analysis from a Human Rights-Based Approach. On behalf of IWRA, I would also like to express our sincere gratitude to our partners, the Human Right to Water and South Africa's Water Research Commission. Without their invaluable collaboration, this masterclass series would not have been possible. At IWRA, we believe that timely collaboration is essential in addressing the pressing global water challenges facing our planet today. Since 2021, we have been organizing a range of masterclasses aimed at disseminating knowledge on current water issues and solutions. Our masterclasses are catered around themes that are highly relevant to the water sector, and we actively collaborate with renowned water institutions to provide a comprehensive online series on these topics. We are thrilled for this year's virtual masterclasses on institutional responsibility to support SDG-6 and the rights to water and sanitation. As we all know, access to clean water and sanitation is a fundamental human right. Yet this right is still not fully realized in many parts of the world. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this masterclass series is designed to help authorities and businesses improve their relationships with the community and support sustainable development goals, specifically SDG-6. Moreover, the course will provide a practical approach for integrating a human rights-based approach to meet corporate sustainability due diligence standards. So I ask you to please visit our website at www.iwra.org to learn more about the masterclasses, our partners for this masterclass series, and IWRA. Thank you for joining us and being a part of this invaluable opportunity. I'll now hand over to your lecturer for today, Raya Marina Stephan, who is an international water law expert, Deputy Editor-in-Chief of IWRA's Water International Journal, and co-chair of IWRA's Water and Climate Change Task Force. Thank you, Raya.
Thank you, Leonore, for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to present in this third master class. I will start by sharing my screen for the few slides I want to show you during this hour. So as Leonore said, in this master class, I will talk to you about the situation analysis from the human rights-based approach. As just for your background and as a reminder for those who attended the previous master classes and for those who did not, the first master class touched upon investment in the right-based approach for sustainable water solutions, and it explained about the challenges to achieve 100% equitable access to water and sanitation. It searched to identify what are the responsibilities for various stakeholders such as businesses, water authority, or ministries, and how to adopt a human right-based approach based on community support and innovation, and finally how to monitor human rights indicators. In the previous master class of last week, the human rights to water and sanitation corporate due diligence for sustainability was touched upon. It reminded about the international human rights law, which apply for different types of institutions. It went into more detail about the human right to water, the human rights to water and sanitation, and it defined the corporate due diligence laws for water and the environment. In this these master classes, in case you missed them, will be available on IWRA's website. The recording will be available. You can catch up if you missed the master classes. Today, in my lecture, I would like to touch upon the human rights-based approach and to see how and to see its relevance to the applicability and to achievement of the human right to water and sanitation. So I will follow during this first hour the following outline. I will give a brief introduction to the human rights. I will try to give you a definition or introduce you to the concept of the human right-based approach. and see how this approach can be integrated in programming various development activities, how it is relevant to the achievement of the human right to water and sanitation, and we finish with concluding remarks about this approach. So, I mean, you are all aware of the fundamental texts, which are the UN Charter of 1945, which is the foundation of the United Nations, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. So the human rights are rights inherent to all human beings, whatever they are, whatever their sex, their nationality, their language, their religion is. And they were, as I said, founded in the UN Charter and later on, more precisely in the Universal Declaration. The Universal Declaration represents a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations, and it sets out for the first time fundamental human rights to be universally protected. It's worth noting and reminding that this declaration is, I can say only between brackets, is only a UN General Assembly resolution, which means it does not have a binding force like a treaty or a convention. But with time, and also because it was confirmed by two important international treaties, this declaration has gained an important moral force and has gained a binding power. So it was complemented by two international covenants, the first one on economic, social, and cultural rights. And you can see that both covenants are universally ratified because you see the important number of parties they have. So the first one deals with the rights such as the right to food, right to work in just and favorable condition, the right to social protection, the right to an adequate standard of living, and the right to education and the enjoyment of benefits of cultural freedom and scientific progress. In the second one, different set of rights are dealt with, more relevant, more political, as the title of the covenant says: freedom of movement, equality before the law, the right to a fair trial, etc., freedom of opinion, etc., among many other rights. And both documents are in force since 1976. There are other international human rights treaties which have expanded this body of international human rights law. This is a quick list of these treaties. And so we have international treaties, but there are also some regional instruments, such as the European Convention on Human Rights, the American Convention on Human Rights, and the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. All these documents have given, let's say, given the international community, a corpus of international norms which represent standards for a life of dignity and well-being for all. And these represent the basis for the human rights-based approach. I wanted just to tell you before going further on that if you have questions that I can address at the end of the lecture, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will, Leonor or another one or someone else will monitor them, and we will address them at the end before closing this first hour. So what is the human right-based approach concept? Very early at the UN, a close relationship was established between human rights and development. And it was, let's say, consolidated or more precisely put on paper at the Vienna conference, which was held in 1993, and which ended with the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action. In this document, it was stated that democracy, development, and respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms are interdependent and mutually reinforcing, which means that development creates the conditions for the effective enjoyment of human rights for all, and at the same time, the fulfillment of human rights is essential to achieving sustainable development in its three dimensions, which are economic, social, and environmental. So they both need each other. One does not go without the other. And this link was strengthened and confirmed with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. If you go to the resolution, you will note the important references to the human rights in the Agenda 2030. You will note the reference to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the human right to water and sanitation is explicitly mentioned. So the human right-based approach is a conceptual framework for the process of human development. Under this approach, poverty is not anymore considered as a lack of income, but it is considered as a lack of the basic capabilities, opportunities, freedoms, and rights. The human right-based approach, I will say it more than once during my talk, represents a shift in the thinking on how to address development. The concept is normatively based on international human rights standards, which I mentioned at the beginning, and which are let's say, continuously developing, because, for example, the human right to water and sanitation was affirmed gradually, but more precisely in 2010 with the UN General Assembly Declaration. The right to a safe environment was developed also very recently, so it's a corpus of norms under continuous evolution. The concept is operationally directed to promote and protect human rights, and it seeks to analyze inequalities at the heart of development problems and to redress discriminatory practices and unjust distribution of power that impede development progress and often result in groups of people being left behind. UN agencies, I mean, as I said, the concept has been slowly developing at the UN and between the UN agencies, and the UN agencies have starting, each one from its side, adopting this approach, but with differences. Even if let's say the agreement on the overall concept was achieved, but there were differences. So it was decided to adopt a common understanding so that the UN, with its agencies, has a common approach to development cooperation and programming. And so there was a resulting document, which represents the UN Interagency Common Understanding on a Human Rights-Based Approach to the Development from 2003. And it ended with three major statements. The first one is that all programs of development, cooperation, policies, and technical assistance should further the realization of human rights as laid down in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international human rights documents. Point 2 is that human rights standards, which are contained in and the principles derived from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international human rights instruments, shall guide all development cooperation and programming in all sectors and in all phases of the programming process. Under this point too, the common standards to all human rights are reminded, and they are the following. All human rights are universal and inalienable. So which means that all people everywhere in the world are entitled to human rights, and then that you cannot, let's say no, I don't want, it's inalienable. The human rights are indivisible. They are all inherent to the dignity of every human person, and they all have equal status. So no human rights has priority to another human right. And actually, you know this very well. They are, like the third point says, they are interdependent and interrelated. The realization of one right often depends wholly or partially upon the realization of other human rights. And more specifically on the human right to water and sanitation, they are defined as at the core of the realization of other rights. If you don't, which is obvious, if you don't access water, you don't access to food, you can't, it's difficult to access to the education, etc. And this was reminded in the previous lectures. All individuals are equal, so equality is one of the standards, and there should be no discrimination between the human rights. They are all entitled to the human rights without discrimination. The participation and inclusion means that every person and all peoples are entitled to be active, free, and to be active in the realization of the human rights in a free manner, and their participation should be meaningful, and to contribute and to enjoy civil, economic, social, cultural, and political development in which human rights and fundamental freedoms can be realized. And finally, we all know that the state is the primary responsible for the realization of the human rights. So the last standard, and not the least, is accountability and rule of law. States and other duty bearers, meaning those who are responsible to the realization of the human rights, they have to comply with the legal norms and standards enshrined in the human rights instruments. And if ever they fail to do so, the right holders, so people, you, me, and anyone on earth, are entitled to a proceeding for appropriate redress before a competent court, and if ever or other adjudicator in accordance with the rules and procedures provided by the law. Sometimes it can be a national court, sometimes it can be to the regional court. I think of the case of Europe, where we have the European Court for Human Rights, and there can be a direct proceeding before this court. And finally, the third statement is that development cooperation contributes to the development of the capacity of duty bearers. So that's the states and who else is responsible alongside the state to the realization of the human right. So sometimes the states need to develop their capacity to meet their obligations, and also the right holders, they have to be aware of their rights to have the capacities to claim their rights. So the capacity building, and you will see throughout my talk, is very important under this human right-based approach concept. So as I already said, and like I said, I will repeat it because it's very important, the human right-based approach represents a shift from more common approaches, more, let's say, traditional approaches such as charity and needs-based. Often projects or activities were directed to give the solution immediately, no access to water. We try to bring a tap and bring water to the people without analyzing why they are without water and what happened and how can we sustainably ensure their right. The aim of this concept is to ensure that the respect, protection, and promotion of human rights for all are integrated into public policies and development programs. The focus of the approach is to build a holistic process and empowering individuals to claim their rights. Again, here is very different from the charity and needs approaches, which focus, as I just said, primarily on input and short-term solution. It's not that we do not need these approaches. Sometimes we are in front of an emergency and we have to find an immediate solution. So we have, let's say, this the usual charity and needs approach, but we all know that often it's not sustainable. And the second important focus of the human rights-based approach is that duty bearers, which is the state, has to fulfill their human right obligation, and sometimes, and often actually not only sometimes, they need strengthening the concerned institution and stakeholders need some strengthening of capacities. Under the concept, people and communities are recognized as having a key role to play in the realization of their rights. So they are no longer passive recipients of assistance. In the example I just mentioned like this, or when we are in front of an emergency, the communities to which the aid is addressed have no voice. There is, let's say, some NGO or some development cooperation agency that is active and looks at the situations and say, okay, we need, let's say here, to build sanitation facilities, and without any consultation, and the sanitation facilities are there, they are used first, but we all know how at this end, with the facilities being neglected and at the end not being used anymore. So under the approach, people and communities are no longer passive recipients, they become, let's say, actors, and they are considered as right holders, and they become actors in their own development, so they have a voice in the realization of any project which address their need, which address their rights. I was going to say needs, and they should be supported with claiming these rights. The concept facilitates the process by which people are able to hold their government to account. So they realize that this right, they have to claim it to their governments. And public action is no longer seen as an assistant tool, but as a way of implementing and sustaining rights for all. So it's not, yes, it's not like I mentioned, the example I mentioned, it was assistance, because we noticed that a Rome camp, wherever in France or elsewhere, I mentioned France because I live in France, needs sanitation facilities. So there's the municipality installed them, but this is an assistance mindset. But then if you want if you apply the human right-based approach, there is consultation with the community, see what they really expect, what they want. There's also an awareness with the community. If we install this facility, it has to be like this, like this. You have to do this and this to keep it to keep its use sustainable, etc. So a distinguishing feature of the human rights-based approach is that it deals with the realization of human rights outcome, but also about how those outcomes are achieved. The process used to secure the rights is just as important as the outcome. So it's not only the result, but it's how we reach this result. But this is also what can represent a drawback or an obstacle, because in this case, the human rights-based approach needs time, the capacity building initiative for the concerned people and communities, and the awareness of their rights takes time. You have to approach them. You have to create the awareness. There is a time-consuming process, and afterwards there has to be a continuing support during an adaptation period. This leads to a sustainable result, but it is, let's say, slower than the needs-based approach, which is quicker to implement. You don't need any consultation, nothing. You just come, you see what you think is needed, and you implement. You provide a service to the beneficiary, but unfortunately, it is noted that in these cases, the result is not sustainable. I took this table from a document that you can consult online, which was prepared by the Human Right to Water, which is partner in these master classes. You can find it on their website. And you can see in this table a comparison between the three approaches, the two traditional ones, the charity and the needs approach, and the rights-based approach. And you see that how the focus is different. So the first two focus on input, and the third human rights-based approach focuses on process and outcome. The first two, they emphasize charity and needs, and the other one emphasizes realizing rights. The individuals in the rights-based approach are recognized as right holders, while the first one is a moral responsibility from the rich towards the poor, and which is a very, let's say, I would say backwards approach. And the needs approach is recognizing that the needs are valid claims. I mean, you can see here the differences which I already mentioned during talking, and don't hesitate to consult the document online. In this scheme, which I took from the Swiss Development Corporation, and you can find it on the mentioned link, you can see how the human right-based approach functions. It functions under the overall head of the International Human Rights Law framework. If ever applicable then we have the regional human rights law. And finally, the national legal framework, which has to consider these two bodies, regional and international. And under the national, if we start from the right holders, they have to know, claim, and realize their rights towards the duty bearer, which at his turn has to respect and protect rights and fulfill obligations. Both need some capacity building and empowerment, and the standards of human rights that I mentioned have to apply as cross-cutting, accountability, equality, and non-discrimination and participation. In this part, I will try to show you, based again on the document prepared by Human Rights to Water, which I can say is also referenced in other documents treating with the human right-based approach, and serves as an important guidelines. How to integrate the human right-based approach in programming. So 4 recognized stages were identified: the situation analysis, the planning, the implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. And again, you see that we have to have as cross-cutting during the process the standards of the human rights, non-discrimination, participation, access to information, accountability, and sustainability. So I will try to go through these 4 stages to give you an overview, and there will be the opportunities for those of you participating to the workshop to go into more details. Stage 1, which is the situation analysis. The objective of this stage is to identify the human right to water and sanitation issues and the causes which hinder the realization in a causality analysis. The stage itself is divided into 4 steps. The first step is to recognize the issue, which means to identify the state's international obligations related to human rights to water. The state, if the state is a party, let's say, to international covenant, one of the international covenant that I mentioned, if the state if it's an African state, the state is perhaps party to the African Charter, etc. And to analyze the national framework on water and sanitation. If there is a water law, what does this water law says? Or if there is another disposition such as regulation or whatever, mentioning the human right to water and sanitation, but it's not enough to mention it, how it is realized, if there is, let's say, a social tariff which make the water fee affordable for even those who are let's say less who cannot afford to pay more, etc. And to evaluate the level of implementation of human rights to water and sanitation in the country, if despite the national framework there are still communities or areas where this right to water is not satisfied. Second step is the stakeholder mapping. Who are the people who are the right bearers? I mean, all humans are the right bearer, but in a specific country or specific area, we have to pay specific attention to the vulnerable groups, such as migrants, people in formal settlements, refugees, women and girls, etc. And to identify who are the duty bearer. Of course, the first duty bearer is the state, but then sometimes, let's say, there's a ministry in charge of water and has to implement or to prepare a policy for implementing the human rights to water and sanitation. It can be the parliament that has to adopt a law, or the national and local authorities who are often in charge of direct water supply or managing sanitation. In some cases, non-state actors can also be duty bearers. So the second step under this stage is to identify, to map all the stakeholders. Third step is the causality analysis. So it is to identify immediate and underlying root causes for the violation or the non-realization of the rights to water and sanitation. So it's going beyond the immediate causes and problems, and it is identifying that factors that shape people's life policies. For example, the law is adopted, but it needs a regulation to be applied, or it needs, or if it's the responsibility of local authority, there might be some capacity building needed. They are not aware, they don't understand what is the human right to work. Perhaps in a local government, it's enough for the people in charge to know that there is water running through the taps, but they are not aware of other criteria such as the affordability or other criteria. Under this step, it is also important to have a holistic and integrated understanding of the water-related issues, which include social, cultural, and economic issues, as well as accessibility and discrimination concerns. It can be that, for example, there's a migrant camp in a city and they don't have any access because access to water or the human right to water is only achieved for those connected to the network. So here we have a problem of accessibility of the water, then the right has to apply to them, so there has to be a solution found to achieve the right. The last step under this first stage is capacity gap analysis. Under this step, we need to examine the extent to which the stakeholders involved in the issue have the capacity to fulfill their roles, either the duty bearers or the right holders. The duty bearer, as I already said, might not be aware of what is missing for the realization of the human rights to water and sanitation in their country. It's not always enough to adopt a law, and perhaps a regulation is missing, and perhaps something else is still missing at a more local ground. And the rights holder, they are often not aware of their rights, so they have to be we have to analyze what are their what capacity needs. The second stage is the planning. So we want to improve the human rights to water and sanitation by targeting the root causes of the lack of access to water and sanitation and building the capacities of both right holders and duty bearers. So here we enter into action. We also have more than one step. The first one is to define the objective and the results. So based on the finding of stage one, for example, if we found that the law is here, is set, but the regulation is here and set, but then there has to be some local implications. So this is one of the findings. So how to proceed with the local aspects? How to integrate we need also to integrate the human rights standards, which I have mentioned more than once, and which are cross-cutting during the whole process, which represent an implication for the content and the formulation process. We want to align the objectives with the country's human rights commitments and priorities, and to ensure progressive realization. This is what we have to understand, is that the right cannot be realized at once. There is a progressive mise en route, like we say in French, a progressive realization. Defining the activities is the second step. so mainly the activities are strengthening activities, so creating the awareness about human rights for right holders and duty bearers, how to implement the human rights for duty bearers, and advocacy. We have to continue advocacy for reaching broader reforms and changes. Perhaps we have achieved, let's say, the realization of the human right to water to a certain category of citizens in a country, but there are still needs to achieve this right for others. For example, the connected to a network see their rights achieved because there are a social tariff is applied. The water cannot be cut, even if they cannot pay the bill. There are solutions that can be found to pay the bill, etc. But what happens with those, for example, that are not connected? So there is still need to continue the advocacy to pursue the full realization of the right, but sometimes also it is linked to other to the realization of other like I already said, that all these rights are interconnected and equal between each other. The third stage is the implementation stage. So the programs or projects contribute to further the human rights to water and sanitation. And again, the human rights principles and standards are consistently being respected throughout the implementation process. So under the first step, ensuring non-discriminatory practices, it's that all people are being fully considered and are able to participate on equal footing. So the activities, the implementation activities, do not consider only one category of people. At the end, it might start with one category. I'm not saying that we start with the whole communities, but it might start with one community, one category of people, migrants, for example, let's say, and then it extends progressively to other. There has to be a definition of priorities. The people concerned have to be involved in the decision-making, in a meaningful way, providing real opportunities to influence the planning process. So it is an association of these people to preparing the implementation. And this is an important challenge, how to organize a truly participatory process. This is, again, one of the drawbacks of the approach is that it can be slow because of these challenges that have to be overcome with creating awareness and capacity buildings. And various groups should have the opportunities to participate. I'm just giving here example. Of course, it's based on a case-by-case approach in different countries. It's not always the same settings, but it can be civil society organizations, community-based organization, national human rights institutions, academia, private sector, and of course the communities themselves. Sometimes they are organized and sometimes not, and special emphasis on facilitating the participation of women and people in vulnerable situations. The third step is the accountability and transparency. So the people, it's not only important to involve them, but they have to be continuously informed about what is happening, what has been decided, etc. So the information about the project must be made publicly available to all, and especially to the local population and local authorities. I would say even especially to those directly to those concerned. The last stage is the monitoring and evaluation. So what is to evaluate what was realized, and again, it has to be aligned with the human rights standards. We keep on mentioning this, and the human rights standard provide a way to determine progress. First step is to design a monitoring process integrating the human rights principles, which are the non-discrimination, access to information, participation, accountability, and sustainability. Human rights-based indicators have to be defined to measure processes and outcomes. The Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights of the UN has published a manual on human rights indicators, which represents a reference in this manner, and which I think you can consult easily. The third step is, of course, evaluating the results. What did we reach? What did we achieve? What is still missing? And evaluating the approach throughout the whole intervention. But how is this approach? I mean, I've already mentioned, as you've probably guessed, that how the human rights-based approach, of course, is relevant to the human rights to water and sanitation. Just small reminders here. The human rights-based approach facilitates the implementation of international commitments. For the human rights to water and sanitation, public policy and service provision standards should meet the criteria of this right, or the criteria of this right, which were detailed in last week's master class, are availability. The water has to be easily available, and accessibility, affordability, which I mentioned more than once here as examples. It has to be of good quality, and it has to be in an acceptable form. And let's say it doesn't need to have a color or a smell that makes it not acceptable for its recipients. The states should act and ensure that the measures taken to fulfill the human rights to water and sanitation are not scaled down or changed. For example, if there is a change in government and that the measures were not necessarily adopted through a law, these measures have to continue. They can be changed for the better, but not going back to the earlier situation. People should be able to engage in legal proceedings to claim their rights, so they should be able to go to court. And if necessary, as I mentioned, they can go to the case to a regional or international courts whenever these are available. Under the human right to base approach and its relevance to the human rights to water and sanitation, we have to ensure that the government plays a central role in the accountability process. The state must assume its responsibilities to establish the dialogue, transparency, and accountability with its citizens. Other relevant stakeholders, such as development partners, the private sector, service operators, and civil society, need to also be associated, knowing that the primary responsibility rests with the state or the need to build state capacities for action. But also these stakeholders have obligations. For example, when a private sector company is in charge, let's say, of water supply, of course, it's in charge of water supply, usually with a contract with the local authority or the water agency, or whatever is the institution in charge in a deemed country. And in general, in this, if the human rights to water and sanitation is, let's say, really put in place, then in the terms of the contract, the private sector company has some obligations to fulfill. And this is what I wanted to say by identify each stakeholder obligations. Development partners is the same. If they are involved in a project, what are the responsibilities? For example, let's say perhaps they are responsible to create capacity building activities, etc. Institutionalizing participation and accountability mechanisms, so building capacities of people who become rights holders rather than passive recipients of support. This is a general statement that I said previously, but here it's direct to the human rights to water and targeting the most vulnerable. Under the human rights-based approach, the vulnerable population is at the core of development policies. Let's say it's the priority population, then there are people that are perhaps less vulnerable, but it's not that we will neglect their rights, but there is a priority approach. So under water and sanitation approaches, interventions, not only what matters under the human rights-based approach is not only the number of the target people, but also the extent of their empowerment and participation in the relevant service and resource management processes. So it means that it's not only that we have given some access to water to these people, but what is important is that we have given them, or they have, let's say, received some capacity building activities that have empowered them and given them the awareness about their right, that they are rights holders. It's not that only they need to drink, but that this is one of their rights. It's a different, like me, just I've been saying, it's a different approach. Recognizing the human rights to water and sanitation for all, regardless of whether people live in informal housing, are migrants or refugees, or are socially isolated, and regardless of their legal status. This is what I mentioned in the early example. So in some countries, the right is realized for those connected to the network. But what about those living in informal housing? They should not be forgotten and omitted. This, the human right-based approach is a holistic approach that helps advance other sectors. It also brings the sustainability compared to the needs and charity approaches. Through the human right-based approach, we have a more sustainable result. And the sustainability is often an issue in the wash sector, where measures are often taken to supply, let's say, with the needs approach, but they are often not sustainable. And often in the wash sector, we still have progress measured in terms of access. We have given access to a community to water, but then we often note that if you come back 2 years later, you will see that the wells, for example, are no more working because for some they were not maintained or whatever, and often in the wash sector, retrogressions are not systematically monitored and recorded. So the human right-based approach is a mechanism for regulation, monitoring, and sector oversight. It assesses the impacts of the action on the realization of human rights and adjusts their measures should their possibilities not lead to sustainable results. So I've reached almost the end of my talk. I will be quick to leave some time. Didn't notice the time, and I will want to give you the chance to ask questions. So the human rights-based approach, as I said, was adopted by UN agencies in their development program, but also bilateral cooperation agencies have started to make their shift in their strategies. The challenges for implementing the human rights-based approach is that the change, it requires a change in strategic and organization positioning. It represents an important shift in the thinking. One difficulty is to identify the most vulnerable people with the lack of data. Data is often disaggregated, and the progressive realization of the human rights to water, sometimes we have no choice but to go through a progressive realization, and through this way, some categories are excluded. So the challenge is to avoid perpetuating these exclusions and creating new ones, and to ensure that non-vulnerable people are not included in the place of vulnerable groups. So the identification of the target people is often difficult. There's a problem of funding because the human rights-based approach requires financial resources for the work that needs to be done upstream of the project with the involvement of all stakeholders. And under current funding mechanism, donors are not always able to obtain prior to project implementation. And donors and developing agencies, as I mentioned, are in the process of integrating this approach. But the challenge is to ensure the effective participation of people and the authorities from the program design stage, and this is where the additional resources are needed. And the funding mechanisms are still often focused on a needs-based approach. So the paradigm shift is needed. Under WASH, yes, as I said, most funding continues to be allocated to infrastructure and technological innovation, which of course are needed, but little financing is available for ensuring authorities uphold their commitments and conducting situation analysis and mobilizing rights holders. There is often a lack of judicial, legal, and regulatory framework for the sector. The framework is not always in place or not clear or accessible. And the difficulty is to identify how to coherently fit into national dynamics. It's not easy when you are developing cooperation. You don't want to be intrusive in the state's, let's say, national matters, but you have to accompany them. So to find the coherent way. And long-term efforts to improve sector governance require strong commitments and the coordination of all stakeholders, and to define the roles and to ensure, again, the participation of communities. So the human rights-based approach is a holistic approach. Each organization has its own specific areas of expertise and a wide range of technical skills. So developing partnership and work in close cooperation to address the specific characteristics of the most vulnerable. Sometimes an NGO needs to work with another NGO, each one having a different range of skills to have this holistic approach. My concluding words is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, that we have an interdependence of rights and the SDGs, of the human rights and the SDGs. The wash sector practitioner need to look outside the wash world to ensure that no one is left behind, and to address as many issues and challenges as possible, particularly those relating to inclusion, gender, participation, disability, and education. And achieving the SDGs requires considering the most vulnerable. The human rights-based approach has the practical operational scope for addressing access to services currently struggling to meet solvent demand. Thank you for your attention. I apologize for being a bit long. Before handing back, if there are some questions, I would like to draw your attention that we have a survey. Perhaps you already have the link in the chat. And if there are some questions, I'm ready to answer in the few minutes left. Or if not, I hope you will join the workshop and we will have opportunity to talk in more details. Thank you.
Thank you, Raya. Raya, we actually have a number of questions, so let's jump right in. So the question is, what are the roles of regulators in the sustainability of water and sanitation service provision in urban, small towns and rural areas? Thank you for the question, Ayodele.
Yes, thank you. This is a very vast question, and I would say that it depends on the legal framework in each country. But what you mean by regulators is, what I understand what you mean by regulators is that those in charge of adopting regulations. So their role is to provide regulation for the adoption of the human right to water, for the application of the human right to water and sanitation with the specific measures. Usually a regulation gives the law gives the overall principles, and the regulation you have the details and how to achieve. And then in the sustainability, this is the good aspect, is again creating the possibilities of and creating the environment and the possibilities for this dialogue and involvement of the communities with the regulators themselves, so that they understand each understand what is what are the rights available, and how to with the possibilities to achieve the rights. There should not be, of course, there are differences in the urban and small towns and rural areas, but let's say in the principles themselves, there should not be differences. Then in rural, for example, remote areas which do not have a network, it will be different. Of course, the realization of the right will be different, but then this will go to a, let's say, more local scale for the realization. In small town, again, it depends on the setting, if there is a network, no network. The financial issues can also be set. The role of the regulators can be very vast as far as see it. So the question is covers the whole, almost the whole lecture. And again, the regulators have also to be aware about their duties.
Thank you, Raya. Then we have another question. It's more of your personal opinion. Do you think SDGs have the potential to advance and even outperform human rights, especially in the areas of economic, social, environmental rights? This is from Isatao Sa. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name.
Yes, thank you, Isatao, for the question. Actually, I'm a human rights person, so I believe that the human rights have the potential to draw the SDGs, but at the same time, if you've seen from the lecture and from what the UN has stated in 2003, so 20 years ago, even before the SDGs, is that development needs the realization of the human rights, but at the same time, the human rights need the development to be satisfied. So they are interlinked. It's not that one has the priority over the other. They are interlinked. Both are needed. The two are needed to make progress. But perhaps the SDGs have strengthened this link because the SDGs are now, let's say, all states have committed to the SDGs, though they are, as I remind you, UN General Assembly resolution, so they are not legally binding, but there's a political commitment of the states to the SDGs. So perhaps they have brought back the human rights to the front of the scene, and they are, but it's not that they will potentially advance. I think the two need to advance together because one goes with the other.
Thank you, Raya. I think we have time for one last question. So this one is from Al-Mu'tazim. Human rights is a term which covers a large meaning, aspects, and parts. And then, do you think this standard, regulation, or policies that are announced by institutions could concern the different cultures in the world? Do you expect the human rights rules to nowadays respect the religion or the different cultures that we have?
The human rights are universal, so they are meant to cover all people on earth, whatever they are, whatever their religion or culture or background is. And if you go to the first fundamental text, which is the Human Rights Declaration, you can find it easily on the web, you will see that they are really rights that apply to everyone. They are not discriminatory based on religion or different cultures. So yes, I do believe that they are universal and that they cover all humans.
Thank you, Raya. So I'd like to thank all of you for joining us again today, especially for those that are joining us for the first time, and those that have committed the time to join us every week for 5 weeks. Thank you very much, Raya. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone, and hope to see many of you in half an hour.